What do you do if you are miles from shore and your ship needs repairs? Viking warriors were performing emergency ship repairs in the freezing North Atlantic over 1,000 years ago, using nothing but basic tools and raw ingenuity. While today's sailors call for Coast Guard rescue at the first sign of trouble, these Norse seafarers had to fix massive longships during storms, battles, and raids, or face certain death in some of the world's most unforgiving waters. Today, we're discovering 12 ingenious Viking repair techniques that kept their legendary vessels afloat through impossible conditions. Get ready to discover maritime survival skills that would make modern shipbuilders jealous. Emergency hull patching, the tar and wool method. When a Viking longship took damage from rocks, enemy weapons, or crushing ice, the crew had minutes to act before their vessel became a tomb. The Vikings' first line of defense was a technique so effective that modern shipbuilders still use variations of it today. They'd grab handfuls of sheep's wool, always kept aboard for exactly this purpose, and soak it in pine tar. This created a waterproof plug that could be hammered into holes from the inside of the ship. The genius was in the materials. Wool expanded when wet, creating an even tighter seal, while the tar provided waterproofing that could last for weeks. Modern maritime archaeology has proven this method could seal holes up to 6 inches across. That's like plugging a dinner plate-sized breach with nothing but materials you could carry in a backpack. The Vikings understood something that took modern science centuries to rediscover. Natural fibers combined with tree resins create incredibly durable waterproof seals. What makes this even more impressive is that Vikings often performed these repairs while under attack or in stormy seas, working by feel in the dark belly of their ships while water poured in around them. They developed specific techniques for working underwater inside the hull, holding their breath while hammering plugs into place. Some crews became so skilled at this that they could patch multiple holes simultaneously, with different crew members working on separate breaches. The quality of their wool made all the difference. They specifically chose wool from sheep that grazed on salt marshes, as this wool naturally repelled water better than inland varieties. They'd prepare the wool by combing it into specific lengths and treating it with fish oil before soaking it in tar, creating what was essentially a medieval composite material that outperformed anything available until modern synthetic fibers were developed. But even the best emergency patch was useless if the entire hull section was compromised, which is where the Vikings' next innovation became a lifesaver: the sacrificial plank system, replaceable hull sections. Here's where Viking shipbuilding genius really shows. They designed their longships with what we'd call sacrificial planks, sections of the hull that were meant to be easily replaceable. It's like having spare tires built into your car's design, except these spare parts could save your life in the middle of the ocean. These planks were held in place with iron rivets that could be removed and replaced using simple tools every crew carried. When a section got damaged beyond repair, the Vikings would literally cut it out and nail in a replacement. They carried pre-cut planks of different sizes, like a maritime hardware store. Archaeological evidence from shipwrecks shows that some Viking vessels had been repaired this way multiple times, with replacement planks from different types of wood. One famous longship found in Norway had oak, pine, and birch planks, all in the same hull, proof of repairs made with whatever materials were available. The brilliance of this system was its simplicity. No specialized knowledge required, no complex measurements needed. Any crew member could perform the repair as long as they could swing a hammer and weren't afraid of getting wet. The Vikings had standardized their plank sizes across different ship types, meaning a plank from one vessel could often fit another. They even developed a ranking system for which planks to sacrifice first during emergency repairs. Planks near the waterline were considered most critical, while those higher up could be temporarily removed to patch lower sections. This triage approach to hull integrity meant they could keep ships afloat, even when multiple sections were damaged. The replacement process itself was remarkably sophisticated. They'd use wooden wedges to temporarily support the hull while removing damaged sections, and they had specific techniques for sealing the gaps around new planks that were faster and more effective than traditional caulking methods. Some crews could replace an entire hull section in under an hour, even in rough seas. Of course, all the hull repairs in the world meant nothing if your rigging failed and left you powerless against wind and waves. Flexible rigging repairs, the rope splicing mastery. Viking longships depended on their single square sail for speed and maneuverability, which meant when rigging failed, the crew was literally dead in the water. But Vikings had developed rope splicing techniques so advanced that modern sailors are still learning from their methods. They used a technique called long splicing that could join two pieces of rope so seamlessly that the repair was actually stronger than the original rope. This wasn't just tying knots. This was precision engineering using nothing nothing but their hands and a simple tool called a marlinspike. The secret was in their rope itself. Viking rope was made from walrus hide, or specially treated plant fibers that became more flexible when wet. This meant their repairs actually got better in the harsh conditions where they were needed most. Modern testing has shown that properly executed Viking rope splices could hold up to 90% of the original rope's strength. What's remarkable is how quickly they could perform these repairs. Experienced Viking sailors could splice a broken line in under 5 minutes, even in rough seas. That's faster than most people today can tie their shoes properly. The Vikings had developed different splicing techniques for different types of loads and conditions. For lines that needed to run through pulleys, they used a tapered splice that wouldn't catch. For standing rigging that bore constant tension, they used a technique that actually got stronger under load. They even had emergency splices that could be done one-handed while holding onto the rigging with the other hand. Their training methods were equally impressive. Young Vikings learned splicing by practicing with their eyes closed, developing the finger sensitivity needed to work by feel in dark or stormy conditions. Master rope workers could identify different types of rope damage just by running their hands along the line, and they knew exactly which repair technique would work best for each situation. The Vikings also understood rope maintenance in ways that prevented many failures before they happened. They had specific schedules for inspecting and rotating their rigging, and they knew how to read the early warning signs of rope failure. This preventive approach meant that catastrophic rigging failures were relatively rare on well-managed Viking ships. But even perfect rigging couldn't help if the water pouring into your ship was rising faster than you could bail it out. The Bailer Brigade, organized water management. Every wooden ship leaks. That's just physics. But Vikings turned this inevitable problem into a precise system that kept their crews alive and their ships afloat. They developed what modern navies would recognize as damage control teams, centuries before the concept officially existed. Each longship had designated bailers, crew members whose primary job during emergencies was water removal. They used specially designed wooden buckets that could move massive amounts of water quickly. But here's the clever part. These buckets were also designed to double as shields, tools, and even cooking pots when needed. The Vikings calculated that a crew of 30 could remove water faster than most leaks could let it in, as long as they worked in organized shifts. They had specific techniques for passing buckets in rough seas, methods for working in cramped spaces, and even ways to bail water while rowing at the same time. Modern naval engineers have studied these techniques and found them remarkably efficient. The Vikings understood fluid dynamics and human endurance in ways that wouldn't be formally studied until centuries later. Their bucket design was a masterpiece of practical engineering. The handles were positioned to allow for efficient passing between crew members, and the shape was optimized to move maximum water with minimum effort. They even had different sized buckets for different crew members, larger ones for the strongest men, smaller ones for situations where speed mattered more than volume. The Vikings developed specific formations for bailing that maximized efficiency while keeping the crew out of each other's way. They had techniques for working in the narrow confines of a longship's hull, methods for bailing while the ship was heeled over in rough seas, and even procedures for continuing to bail while under attack. The most experienced bailers could work in complete darkness, guided only by the sound of water and the feel of the ship's motion. They also understood the psychology of emergency water management. Bailing was exhausting, monotonous work that could break crew morale if not managed properly. Viking leaders developed rotation systems that kept crews fresh, and they had specific songs and chants that helped coordinate the rhythm of bailing while keeping spirits up during long emergency sessions. However, all the bailing in the world couldn't save you if your mast snapped and left you helpless in hostile waters. Mast repair, the splinting technique. When a Viking longship's mast cracked or broke, the crew faced a death sentence, unless they could fix it quickly. These weren't small boats. Viking longships could be over 100 feet long, with masts nearly as tall. Replacing a mast at sea was impossible, but the Vikings developed a splinting technique that could save both ship and crew. They'd lash wooden splints along the length of the crack, using a specific pattern of rope wrapping that distributed stress evenly. The key was using green wood for the splints, freshly cut branches that were still flexible. As this wood dried, it would shrink and tighten the repair, creating a bond stronger than the original mast. Archaeological evidence shows that some Viking masts were repaired multiple times using this method. One mast found in a Danish bog had been splinted in 3 different places, yet was still structurally sound after 1,000 years underground. The Vikings also developed a technique for reinforcing weak spots before they became breaks. They'd wrap sections of the mast with leather strips soaked in pine tar, creating flexible armor that could prevent cracks from spreading. The splinting process required incredible skill and timing. The crew had to work quickly before before the mast failed completely, but they also had to be precise in their measurements and rope work. They developed techniques for supporting the mast while repairs were underway, using temporary stays and props that could hold the enormous weight while splints were being applied. Different types of wood required different splinting approaches. Pine masts needed flexible splints that could bend with the wood's natural movement, while oak masts required rigid splints that could bear enormous loads. The Vikings carried a variety of splinting materials and knew exactly which type to use for different situations. They even had techniques for repairing masts that had broken completely in two. This involved creating a complex framework of splints and supports that essentially built a new mast around the broken pieces. These repairs were so effective that some splinted masts actually became stronger than the original, as the additional wood and binding created a composite structure that could handle greater stresses. The most challenging mast repairs happened during storms, when the broken mast was still under enormous stress from wind and waves. Vikings developed techniques for working aloft in these conditions, using safety lines and specialized knots that allowed them to work with both hands while remaining secured to the rigging. Even with a perfectly repaired mast, you were still in trouble if your sail looked like it had been through a shredder. Sail patching, the overlapping method. A torn sail in Viking times meant more than just slower travel. It could mean the difference between reaching safety and being caught by enemies or storms. Vikings developed sail repair techniques that were so effective, pieces of their patched sails have survived over 1,000 years. Their method involved cutting patches larger than the tear and overlapping them on both sides of the damage. But here's the genius part. They used a specific stitching pattern that actually made the repaired section stronger than the original sail. The stitches were angled to distribute stress across the patch rather than concentrating it at the tear. They carried repair materials that were perfectly suited to the job: thin leather strips, sinew thread, and specially treated cloth that matched their sail's weight and flexibility. Some crews even carried pre-made patches in common sizes, like a medieval version of duct tape. Modern sailmakers have analyzed Viking repair techniques and found them remarkably sophisticated. The Vikings understood fabric stress and wind dynamics in ways that wouldn't be formally studied until the age of scientific sailing. The Vikings had developed different patching techniques for different types of tiers. Small punctures got simple patches, but long tiers required complex reinforcement patterns that prevented the damage from spreading. They understood that sails under wind pressure behaved differently than static fabric, and their repair methods accounted for the dynamic stresses that sails experienced. Their stitching techniques were equally advanced. They used different thread materials for different parts of the repair: strong sinew for high-stress areas, flexible plant fibers for sections that needed to stretch, and waterproof materials for patches that would be exposed to spray and rain. The stitching patterns themselves were designed to flex with the sail rather than creating rigid spots that could become new failure points. Viking sail repairs often had to be done while the sail was still in use, which required techniques for working on fabric under tension. They developed methods for temporarily supporting torn sections while repairs were made, and they could patch sails while they were still drawing wind. This meant that repairs could be made without losing precious speed or maneuverability. The most impressive sail repairs were done during battles, when torn sails had to be patched while arrows and spears were flying. Vikings developed techniques for making quick battlefield repairs that would hold long enough to escape, then making more permanent repairs once they reached safety. But all the sail repairs in the world were useless if you couldn't control where your ship was going. Steering oar replacement, the emergency rudder. Viking longships were steered by a large oar mounted on the right side of the ship, which is why we call it starboard, steerboard. When this crucial component broke, the ship became uncontrollable. But Vikings had developed techniques for creating emergency steering systems using materials every ship carried. They could lash together spare oars, planks, and even shields to create a temporary steering oar. The trick was getting the balance right. Too heavy, and it would be impossible to control. Too light, and it wouldn't have enough authority over the ship's direction. The Vikings understood leverage and water flow in ways that let them calculate the right size and shape for emergency rudders. They had specific techniques for mounting these temporary systems that could be done quickly even in rough seas. Some Viking ships have been found with permanent backup steering systems, secondary mounting points that could accept emergency rudders. This shows they planned for equipment failure in ways that modern recreational boaters rarely consider. The process of creating an emergency steering oar was like performing surgery on a moving patient. The crew had to work over the side of the ship, often in rough seas, while maintaining enough control to keep the vessel from spinning out of control. They developed techniques for temporarily steering with oars from both sides of the ship while the emergency rudder was being constructed. Different materials required different construction techniques. Shields made lightweight emergency rudders that were easy to control but lacked authority in heavy seas. Spare planks created more effective rudders but required more complex lashing patterns to hold together under stress. The Vikings had standardized designs for different types of emergency rudders, each optimized for specific conditions and available materials. They also understood the importance of rudder placement and angle. An emergency rudder mounted too high would lose effectiveness in rough seas, while one mounted too low would create excessive drag. They had techniques for adjusting the depth and angle of emergency rudders to match sea conditions and ship loading. The most challenging aspect was creating the mounting system that could handle the enormous forces involved in steering a large ship. Vikings developed lashing techniques that could distribute these forces across multiple attachment points, preventing the emergency rudder from tearing away from the ship when it was needed most. Of course, even the best steering system was worthless if water was pouring through gaps in your hull faster than you could patch them. Caulking techniques. The moss and tar system. The gaps between planks in Viking longships needed constant maintenance to stay watertight. The Vikings developed a caulking system using materials that were abundant in their homeland: moss, animal hair, and pine tar. They'd stuff dried moss mixed with animal hair into the gaps between planks, then seal it with hot pine tar. This created a flexible, waterproof seal that could expand and contract with the wood as temperature and humidity changed. The organic materials would actually improve over time as they absorbed water and swelled. What's remarkable is that this system was designed to be maintained at sea. Vikings carried small pots for heating tar and had techniques for applying it safely on a moving ship. They understood that maintenance was ongoing, not something you did only in port. Modern boat builders have rediscovered these techniques and found them superior to many synthetic materials for wooden boat construction. The Vikings' caulking could last for years and was completely renewable using natural materials. The Vikings had developed different caulking mixtures for different parts of the ship. Areas below the waterline got a mixture heavy on animal fat and tar for maximum waterproofing, while areas above the waterline used more moss and hair for flexibility. They understood that different parts of the hull experienced different stresses and environmental conditions. Their technique for heating and applying tar at sea was particularly ingenious. They used small iron pots that could be heated with charcoal braziers, but they had developed safety techniques that prevented fires on wooden ships. The tar was heated to specific temperatures: too cool and it wouldn't penetrate properly, too hot and it would burn the organic materials it was supposed to seal. The application process required perfect timing and coordination. One crew member would heat the tar while others prepared the caulking materials and cleaned out old, failed caulking. The hot tar had to be applied quickly before it cooled, but carefully enough to avoid burns or waste. Vikings developed special tools, essentially primitive caulking irons, that allowed them to work the hot tar deep into the seams between planks. They also understood preventive caulking maintenance. Rather than waiting for leaks to develop, experienced crews would inspect and recaulk sections of the hull on a regular schedule. They could identify areas where caulking was beginning to fail before water started coming through, allowing them to make repairs in calm conditions rather than during emergencies. But even perfectly caulked hulls could be crushed like eggshells when Viking ships encountered the deadly ice of northern waters. Ice damage prevention. The flexible hull concept. Viking longships regularly encountered ice that could crush conventional vessels, but their ships were designed with flexibility that allowed them to survive conditions that would destroy rigid boats. When ice damage did occur, they had specific repair techniques adapted to these unique challenges. They understood that ice damage was different from other types of hull damage. It created long, crushing breaks rather than clean holes. Their repair technique involved creating flexible patches that could move with the ship rather than rigid repairs that might crack under stress. Using thin, overlapping planks held with leather lashings rather than rigid nails, they could create repairs that were actually more flexible than the original hull. This technique allowed repaired sections to bend with ice pressure rather than breaking. Archaeological evidence shows that some Viking ships survived multiple encounters with pack ice, with repair layers that tell the story of their Arctic adventures. The Vikings had learned to read ice conditions in ways that helped them avoid the worst damage. They understood the difference between solid pack ice that could be navigated around and shifting ice flows that could trap and crush a ship. When ice damage was unavoidable, they had techniques for minimizing it by positioning the ship to take damage in less critical areas. Their flexible repair system was based on the principle that it was better to have a hull that leaked slightly but remained intact than one that was perfectly watertight but brittle. They used leather strips, sinew, and specially treated rope to create repairs that could flex with the ship's movement through ice fields. The most innovative aspect of their ice damage repairs was the use of animal fat and fur as insulation and cushioning. They would pack damaged areas with seal fat and fur, creating repairs that not only sealed leaks, but also provided some protection against future ice impacts. This organic padding could absorb impacts that would shatter rigid repairs. Vikings also developed techniques for working in extreme cold conditions, where normal repair materials became brittle and unworkable. They had methods for keeping tar and other materials warm enough to use, and they understood how different materials behaved in freezing temperatures. When standard repair materials weren't available, Vikings had to get creative with whatever they had on hand, including their own weapons. Tool improvisation, making repairs with weapons. Viking crews had to be ready to turn their weapons into repair tools at a moment's notice. Axes became adzes for shaping wood, spear points became awls for making holes, and sword blades could be used as pry bars or scrapers. They developed specific techniques for using weapons as tools without damaging them. A Viking axe could be used to shape replacement planks, but only if you knew the right angle and technique to avoid dulling the blade. These weren't desperate improvisations. They were planned techniques that every crew member learned. The Vikings understood that in emergency situations, the distinction between weapons and tools disappeared. Their equipment was designed with this dual purpose in mind, and their training included both combat and repair applications for every piece of gear they carried. Modern survival experts have studied these techniques and found them remarkably effective. The Vikings had solved the problem of carrying specialized tools by making their existing equipment serve multiple purposes. The versatility of Viking weapons as repair tools was remarkable. Spear points could be used to punch holes for rope lashings, but they could also serve as measuring devices for spacing repairs evenly. Sword blades were excellent for scraping old caulking from seams, and their flat surfaces could be used to spread tar evenly. Even shields had repair applications. They could be used as work surfaces, water scoops, or temporary patches for large holes. The Vikings had developed specific techniques for each weapon tool conversion. Using an axe as an adze required a completely different grip and cutting angle than using it as a weapon. They practiced these techniques regularly, understanding that in an emergency, there would be no time to figure out the proper method. They also understood the limitations of using weapons as tools. Repeated use for repairs could dull blades or damage hafts, potentially making the weapons less effective when they were needed for fighting. Vikings developed rotation systems that spread the wear across multiple weapons, and they had techniques for field sharpening and maintenance that could restore weapons after they'd been used for repairs. The psychological aspect was important too. Vikings had to overcome the natural reluctance to use precious weapons for mundane repair work. They developed a mindset that viewed ship survival as the highest priority. A damaged weapon was useless if the ship sank and took everyone with it. Of course, having the right tools and techniques meant nothing if you tried to use them at the wrong time. Vikings had to become masters of timing their repairs to work with nature rather than against it. Weather-based repair timing, working with nature. Vikings understood that some repairs could only be done in specific weather conditions, and they developed techniques for timing their maintenance work to take advantage of natural conditions. They knew when to wait for calmer seas and when to work through storms. For major repairs, they'd seek out protected waters, fjords, bays, or the lee side of islands. But they also had techniques for emergency repairs that could be done in any conditions. They understood the difference between repairs that required precision and those that just needed to hold until better conditions arrived. They developed a system of temporary repairs that could be upgraded later. A quick patch job might hold for hours, buying time to reach calmer waters where a permanent repair could be made. This layered approach to maintenance kept crews alive when single solution thinking would have failed. Modern emergency response teams use similar concepts. Immediate life-saving measures, followed by more comprehensive treatment when conditions allow. The Vikings had become expert weather readers, understanding how different conditions affected both the need for repairs and the ability to make them. They knew that certain types of damage were more likely in specific weather patterns, and they prepared accordingly. High winds meant rigging stress and potential sail damage, while heavy seas increased the likelihood of hull damage from wave impact. artifacts. They had developed repair techniques specifically adapted to different weather conditions. Calm weather allowed for precision work and permanent repairs, but they also had techniques for working in rough seas when precision was impossible. They understood that a rough repair made in bad conditions was often better than waiting for perfect conditions that might never come. Their timing strategies extended beyond just weather conditions. They understood tidal patterns and how they affected access to beaches for major repairs. They knew the seasonal patterns of storms and ice, allowing them to plan long voyages around the most dangerous periods. They even understood how moon phases affected visibility for night repairs. The Vikings also developed techniques for predicting weather changes that would affect repair work. They could read cloud patterns, wind shifts, and sea conditions to anticipate when weather windows would open or close. This allowed them to start complex repairs when conditions were favorable and complete them before conditions deteriorated. But even the most perfectly timed individual repair effort was doomed to fail without the final element that made Viking ship maintenance truly effective: flawless crew coordination. The repair chain system. Perhaps the most impressive aspect of Viking ship repair was how they organized their crews to work efficiently in crisis situations. Every crew member had specific roles and responsibilities that kicked in automatically when repairs were needed. They used a chain system where materials and tools were passed from person to person, allowing repairs to continue even when the ship was crowded or when crew members were needed for other tasks like rowing or fighting. This system meant that repairs could happen simultaneously with navigation, combat, or other critical activities. The Vikings understood that ship repair was a team effort that required coordination and communication. They had specific calls and signals for different types of repairs, allowing the crew to organize quickly even in chaotic conditions. Modern naval damage control procedures are based on similar principles: organized response, clear communication, and practice procedures that work under stress. The Viking repair chain system was like a well-choreographed dance, where every crew member knew their role without needing detailed instructions. When damage occurred, the crew would automatically form repair teams based on their skills and the type of damage. The strongest men would handle heavy lifting and structural repairs, while those with fine motor skills would work on rigging and sail repairs. Communication was crucial in these systems. Vikings developed a vocabulary of repair commands that could be understood over the noise of wind, waves, and combat. They had hand signals for situations where verbal communication was impossible, and they trained crew members to work together so seamlessly that minimal communication was needed. The chain system also included logistics, ensuring that repair materials and tools reached the right people at the right time. They had designated crew members whose job was to manage the flow of materials, preventing bottlenecks that could slow critical repairs. They understood that having the right materials in the wrong place was almost as bad as not having them at all. Training for these coordination systems happened constantly during normal sailing operations. Vikings would practice repair scenarios during calm weather, drilling the crew until the responses became automatic. They understood that in real emergencies, there would be no time to think, only time to react based on training and muscle memory. The most sophisticated aspect of their coordination system was the ability to prioritize multiple simultaneous repairs. When a ship suffered extensive damage, the crew had to decide which repairs were most critical and allocate their limited resources accordingly. Vikings developed decision-making systems that allowed rapid triage of damage and efficient allocation of repair efforts. These 12 Viking repair techniques represent more than just maritime maintenance. They're a masterclass in preparation, ingenuity, and survival under impossible conditions. What's remarkable is how accessible these methods remain today. The materials were simple, the techniques were learnable, and the principles behind them are as sound now as they were 1,000 years ago. If you have enjoyed raiding the past with us, then go ahead and pillage that like button and subscribe for more interesting journeys into the world of Midgard living.